People need to know about a species in order to act on behalf of that species and protect their habitat. Polar Bears International is uniquely poised to connect people to polar bears in the Arctic. The Tender Connections program allows us to connect scientists with viewers around the globe. And the goal of outreach like this is to instill hope and inspire action in our viewers.
We have a mobile broadcast studio, and we reach out to classrooms all over the world to talk about polar bears in the western Hudson Bay. We have a couple different kinds of connections that we do out here. Sometimes it's live back and forth, and other times the live connection goes out and questions are chatted back for us to answer.
Will polar bears go extinct?
What can my class do to help protect sea ice?
Just the other day, we had a Skype chat with an entire school in Kiev, and we got to show them their very first polar bear, and when that comes up on the screen, it's really cool.
It's neat to maybe inspire the next generation of scientists. Seeing their faces light up when we show them videos and photos and talk about our research gives us motivation to keep going and keep doing what we're doing.
Join us as we stream live. You can view the broadcast on our website or watch live chats on social media. Tune in, ask questions, join our efforts to protect polar bears and the sea ice they depend on.
You have to steam it.
Hello and welcome to Polar Bears International Spring Tender Connections series. My name is BJ Kirschhoffer and I'm the Director of Field Operations for Polar Bears International. We don't usually offer Tender Connections in the spring, but we figured now more than ever our community could use a fresh opportunity for virtual learning and some Arctic inspiration. So for the months of April and May, we're broadcasting live from our homes across the globe with content catered to kids. But of course, anybody is welcome to join. Today's webcast is called Counting Calories. How much energy does it take to be a polar bear? So really, we're talking about food today. We are talking about polar bear food. This is one of my favorite subjects. So please stay tuned. Our partner on today's program is Explore.org and the San Diego Zoo Global. Our target audience is secondary students, but like I said earlier, all are welcome to join. This program will last about 30 minutes and will include time for questions and answers. If, while you're watching, you have a question, please feel free to submit them to either the chat window below if you see it, or you could send them to questions@pbears.org. We have folks standing by to take your questions and filter them over to us, and so we can get them answered by our experts. Speaking of our experts, let's jump to them right now. First, let's start with Megan. Megan, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. It's great to be here this morning. I'm Dr. Megan Owen, and I am the Director of Population Sustainability at the San Diego Zoo Global. And what that means is that I am a conservation biologist, and I'm super excited to get to call polar bears one of my key study species. San Diego Zoo has been dedicated to polar bear conservation for decades, and our polar bear science program has been going on for the past 15 years or so. So it's great to be here.
It's great to have you. Thanks, Megan, for joining us. And Anthony, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. So I'm Anthony Pagano. I'm a postdoctoral research fellow with San Diego Zoo Global. And I've spent, about 11 years now doing research on polar bears. I spent about 10 years working for U.S. Geological Survey as a research wildlife biologist, working up on polar bears in Alaska, and then I've spent the past 2 years as a postdoctoral researcher for San Diego Zoo Global.
Right, that is great. Thanks so much for joining us today, for being with us today and helping us understand a little bit about polar bears and what they eat and how they use that energy. So let's start out with kind of the most basic. Let's just start with calories. What is a calorie and what does it measure?
Ooh, so a calorie is energy. So when we eat food, whether it's any kind of organism, animal or otherwise, that consumes food, it gives them energy, and they need that energy to survive. So calories are sort of what makes life possible.
So what do polar bears eat then? What would be their favorite source of calories?
The polar bear's
so
favorite source of calories. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Anthony.
Oh, sorry, Megan. I was just going to say, so polar bears are their primary diet is seals. So they walk primarily on the surface of the sea ice and look for seals to eat. They primarily try to catch seals. Their best time for catching seals is in the spring. So they can pretty much double their body mass by catching seals in the spring, and that they use that to sustain themselves for basically the rest of the year. So they spend a good 3 to 4 months in the spring. So right around this time of year, they should be having great success locating and catching seals. And they primarily catch ring seals and bearded seals. Those are two of the most ice-dependent seals that occur in the Arctic. And the ring seals have layers that they dig out into the sea ice, and they give birth to their pups in those layers, and the polar bears will actually hunt the seal pups within those layers. They'll actually locate a layer. They'll smell for the layer, and then once they find a layer, they'll actually jump and pounce on top of that layer, break the ice covering that covers the layer, and in many cases they'll be able to catch the pups, and then they'll also hunt seals that haul out on the sea ice, especially bearded seals will haul out on the edge of the sea ice, and adult male polar bears prefer hunting the bearded seals, which are much bigger than ring seals. And then the main way that they hunt seals is by
the big seals are kind of the big meal deal, huh? The bearded seals.
That's
and the
right.
Ring seals would be kind of the smaller meal deal.
That's right. Yep, for sure. So a bearded seal can sustain a polar bear for a really long time. A ring seal can sustain them for a good 10 days, just because they're so dense with blubber. But the main way that polar bears
exactly how long they can kind of go off of a seal. I don't want to jump over this really important piece. Like, this is a critical time for polar bears right now, right? Like, their habitat is frozen. These seals are having their pups, and the polar bears are able to get to those pups right now. This is where they're going to really be able to build a lot of body weight, right? They're really going to fatten up.
Yeah, polar bears, they go through sort of this feast and famine life cycle. So polar bears need to eat everything they can while they can, and they can store that fat, and that can sustain them when seals aren't available to eat. And they really, really need those seals for food because, as you said before, seals have this incredibly dense energy content because of all their fat. And polar bears depend on that high caloric value food source to survive through long periods where they're not going to be able to find any food.
I like to think of it almost maybe like your cell phone battery or something like that, maybe your parents' cell phone battery. Polar bears are out there recharging right now, right? They're plugged into the wall, and they're really fattening up, and because they don't really know how long they're going to have to use their phone for, how long they're going to have to discharge for before they can maybe get at some seals again. So they want to get as much food as they can right now. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
And then so for polar bears in some parts of the Arctic too, they'll go months and months without any access to food. And so in those parts of the Arctic, it's just incredibly important that they store up on as much as they possibly can. So all seals are fair game this time of year.
So Anthony, why do polar bears eat seals, and why not fish or something else?
Yeah, polar bears are really unique. They're basically the only mammal that will subsist on the surface of the sea ice, or they can subsist on the surface of the sea ice throughout the year, and to do that, they're really dependent on this really high energy diet that they get from seals. So they occur in this really remote and inhospitable environment where they're moving through ice and in many cases swimming, and they're burning a lot of energy to do that. And they're also really large. So the largest, they occur in the marine environment, but they're basically a terrestrial animal. They have legs, and they walk and they're basically the largest land carnivore that we have still in existence. And so to meet that energy demand, because of their large size, because they occur in this inhospitable environment where they're walking through this rugged terrain, they burn a lot of energy, and so they really need a really high fat to meet that energy demand. So a fish is going to provide really a small fraction of the energy they get from catching seals. And then on top of that, what they've developed is a way to catch seals that really minimizes the energy that they have to expend to catch them. So they, for the most part, the way they catch seals is by locating a breathing hole. So the seals will scratch out holes in the ice that they use to breathe, because seals are mammals like us, and they have to breathe air. And so they scratch out these holes in the ice, and they'll come up to the surface to breathe, and then they'll dive back down under into the water and try to catch fish. And the polar bears will locate these breathing holes, and they'll basically just lay at the hole for, could be hours. In some cases, it's been documented for even a day for a polar bear to just lie by a seal's breathing hole. And so this allows them to just basically rest until a seal comes up to breathe. Whereas if you're trying to catch fish, you're going to be exerting a lot of energy, running around through a river or stream trying to catch fish, whereas a polar bear can just sit by a hole and wait for the seal to come up to breathe.
That's pretty convenient. I mean, just to be able to sit and have your meal delivered, by a small hole in the ice. It sounds pretty good to me. When I want a meal, I have to go make it in the kitchen. Like, geez, they got it easy. Well, maybe not. It's not an easy place to make a living. So I'm an adult human. I require about 2,000 calories a day, they say. I don't know. Maybe I eat more than that. Megan, how much energy does it take to run a polar bear?
It takes a lot of energy to run a polar bear. As Anthony said, they're the largest terrestrial carnivore, and they actually require about 12,000 calories a day to survive. And that's just an incredibly high amount. So they really, really, really need to get those seals while they can. And so that's
a lot of food.
That's a lot of food. And depending on how a polar bear is moving about their landscape or their seascape, it costs more. So if they're swimming, that's going to require more calories to sustain them. So they really, really have to make sure that they get enough food while it's available. So spring is super important for polar bears.
So Megan, one of my favorite foods is a corn dog. They say, the internet says, there's 450 calories in a corn dog. A polar bear would have to eat 26 corn dogs a day in order to just make it by.
26 corn dogs. I mean, that's a lot of corn dogs, but I think that would be a really bad choice for a polar bear. And, it's kind of interesting that you bring up that comparison, because people are constantly thinking about, what else could a polar bear eat? If they can't access those seals, might there be other things that polar bears can eat? But, a corn dog is not as good a food source as a seal. The seal fat is really important to polar bears. So, yeah, corn dogs, not a good choice for you or for the polar bears.
Well, yeah, you're probably right. I shouldn't eat 26 corn dogs in a day. So that's an interesting point. So it's really not about exactly, just getting food. It's not about just getting the 12,000 calories per day. It's something quite specific that they're looking for in those calories, right? They're looking for the fat.
Yeah, they are fat lovers. So the fancy word for a fat lover is a lipovore. So lipo means fat and vor means what you love to eat. And polar bears they get the dense calories from that fat, and then there's also specific nutrients that come along with that. When I work at the San Diego Zoo, and we have polar bears at our facility. And we don't feed them seal fat, but we do feed them fat from other meat sources as well as other items. And they love eating other things. Sometimes they'll even eat grapes, but they don't get what they need to sustain them from those other food sources. So the fat is just critical.
So I want to talk a little bit about, we aren't just coming up with these numbers kind of out of our head, how much it takes to run a polar bear, things like that. These people that we're speaking with today have studied this, and there's ways you can look at how much energy a polar bear consumes. This is pretty interesting stuff. So it's not just like we look at a polar bear and say, I think it consumes 12,000 calories in a day. How do you go about, Anthony? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about how you go about measuring how much energy a polar bear uses every day.
Sure. Yeah. So part of the research that I've done on polar bears, in particular for part of my doctoral work, was trying to look at how much energy they're expending in the wild. And to do that, we developed a bunch of different techniques, and we kind of started off with sort of the concept that Fitbit uses. So if you're familiar with athletes and different people that have it, where it provides a measure of how much energy you're expending, so number of calories you're expending when you're walking or running or biking or swimming. Some of them have other sensors that can provide things like what your heart rate is. We were basically working with that same concept, but with a very different species, of course, with polar bears. So with a Fitbit, they've calibrated these devices by having people jog on a treadmill while they have a mask on, and they can measure how much oxygen somebody is taking in, and that can be used as a measure of energy expenditure, because we of course use oxygen to create energy, just like how plants use carbon dioxide to create energy. We use oxygen to create energy. And so if you can measure how much oxygen somebody's taking in, you can actually calculate how much energy they're expending. And so we want to do the same thing with polar bears. So we couldn't just put a mask on them. We had to actually build a chamber. And so we built a chamber and we attached that to a treadmill. And the first question we had was, is what does it cost them to rest? And then after that, we wanted to know what it costs them to walk. And so we worked with the Oregon Zoo and the San Diego Zoo. And over the course of close to a year, the bears at those facilities were trained to voluntarily walk on the treadmill. And you can see this is Tossel at the Oregon Zoo. She gets a fish reward for so she was to get a reward, and she was enriched by getting to interact with her keepers, and we could measure what her oxygen consumption was while she was walking. And then you also notice that she has a collar on. So we had the collar on that allowed us to have that Fitbit type style device. It's called an accelerometer. And we could link the measures from that Fitbit with what she was expending while she walked based on her oxygen consumption, and allowed us to actually get an understanding of what these animals to walk and to rest. And then we could apply that to collars that we were putting out on polar bears in the wild, and that has started to give us insight into what it's actually costing these bears in the wild. The polar bears don't.
Before we get too far down the road here, Anthony, I want to unpack some of this, because you just covered a huge amount of information. First of all, Megan, the polar bear we were watching there, was that bear out on the sea ice, or where was that bear?
The polar bear walking on the treadmill? Is that the one you're referring to?
Yeah.
So
sorry, the one walking on the treadmill.
Yeah. So that polar bear was up at the Oregon Zoo, and as Anthony described, this is where zoos have just a tremendous opportunity to contribute to conservation science. So here we can get this great detailed look at what it costs a polar bear to move. And by creating this test space and training the polar bear to participate in this study, we learned a heck of a lot. And the training all happens through positive reinforcement. So the keepers really contribute a lot to the development of the study methods, because they understand the bears, they understand what's going to motivate the bears and keep them engaged in the work in a very positive way. And over the course of months, the keepers at the Oregon Zoo and at the San Diego Zoo were able to engage the bears in this scientific study. And it really generated some incredible data, and now we know a lot more about what it costs a polar bear energetically to survive. And Anthony's work helped us realize that it costs more for them to survive than we had ever thought before. So it was just this great merging of the animal care expertise that zookeepers have and scientific questions that are relevant for conservation.
So this bear that we were watching there, you know, it kind of has two jobs, huh? The bear was can be out in the zoo, and people can learn about the bear at the zoo, but then part-time it goes behind the scenes there and interacts with its keepers and walks on a treadmill and helps inform science, huh?
Yeah, and it's great for the bears as well because, you know, polar bears are incredibly intelligent animals. They have to problem solve all the time as they're moving about the sea ice. And so when we engage them in scientific studies such as these, it gives them a challenge and a challenge that they can meet and be rewarded for in a positive way. And that positive way for a polar bear is food. It's always about food.
I could probably be trained the same way. But anyways, so the treadmill wasn't the only thing you guys looked at as well, right? We also wanted to understand how much energy a polar bear used when it swims. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah. So polar bears in the wild, they don't just walk on the surface and rest on the surface of the ice. They're also swimming, and we've been actually documenting them swimming more frequently than they have in the past. And so we really wanted to find out what it's actually them to swim. And so working with the Oregon Zoo again, we actually built a swim flume similar to the treadmill. It was a chamber that allowed the bear to swim into this area that was kind of a side section of their exhibit. And then we purchased an endless pool motor, which some of you might be familiar with, but it's basically a motor that creates a current within a small space. And some people use them for swimming within a small space. They can basically swim in front of this current. And so it created a current that the bears could swim in front of. And then similar to the treadmill, we could measure their oxygen consumption while the bear was swimming, and it's insight into what it actually costs a polar bear in the wild to swim.
So as the climate warms here, do we expect bears to swim more than they did in the past, or about the same?
Yeah, so what we've been documenting, particularly in the area north of Alaska, as well as further around Greenland, we've been documenting bears swimming more frequently. And we've seen bears swimming. One bear was documented swimming about 680 kilometers over the course of about 10 days. And then we've also documented bears swimming for about 2 weeks, almost continuously. And so we've seen bears making really extreme long distance swims in some cases with the ice breaking up to a greater extent than it had historically, and we're seeing bears swimming more frequently as there's greater amounts of open water than there had been in the past.
So we're getting some really great questions coming in. I'm going to ask this of both of you. Tristan in second grade, and I know it's Tristan in Minnesota. I'm wondering if this isn't he. But Megan, why do you study polar bears instead of other animals?
Oh, that's a great question, Tristan. I actually do study other animals, and I'm going to say this for the world to hear. Polar bears are my favorite. And I feel very lucky that I get to study polar bears. I actually started my career as a biologist working in the Arctic on other species about 25 years ago. And I just fell in love with the Arctic. It's just an incredibly beautiful, biodiverse place. And polar bears are the apex predator. They're at the top of the food chain. You know, they are the king of the Arctic. And they're the challenges they face with sea ice losses driven by climate change. But even under the best of circumstances, their lives are fascinating. And so I feel really lucky as a scientist who works for a conservation organization to get to study polar bears. There's a lot we don't know about polar bears, their basic biology. And then as the climate changes, we don't know how they are going to be impacted in a lot of ways. So I feel like we can use science to better understand what polar bears need. And the other thing to think about too is that polar bears are probably they're on the leading edge of climate change and the impacts of climate change. So if we can understand how polar bears are going to be impacted, That will help us understand how other species and ecosystems will also be impacted. So they tell us a lot about the health of our planet. So I really enjoy getting to work with them. I have to say also, getting to work with them at the San Diego Zoo and watching their behavior, they're just fascinating to watch. They move so beautifully in the water and they have personalities. And again, they're highly intelligent. So I highly recommend it.
And Anthony, how about you? Why polar bears?
Yeah, so in some ways, my kind of story is similar to Megan. So I was actually always interested in ducks, and I spent a number of years working on ducks, including I got my master's degree in Minnesota working on ducks, and I'd always wanted to do work up in Alaska. I was always fascinated by the last frontier and getting to explore that whole area. And so I started doing work on ducks and seabirds up in Alaska. And it just so happened that an opportunity came about to start working on polar bears. And once I started working on them, I kind of fell in love with polar bears. And they're just such an amazing and unique. And their lifestyle, the environment that they live in, their hunting strategies, and their intelligence. It's, it's really fascinating to do research on them and to learn about them. And so, similar to Megan, I feel really fortunate to have the opportunity to study them and to learn about them. And you're seeing some videos that we were able to record from polar bears in the wild from video camera collars that we put on them. And one of the things that I really learned by watching these videos, so we collected about video from about 10 bears, and each bear was unique in their lifestyle, their hunting strategies, how they moved on the sea ice, how far they might move, techniques they were using for trying to catch sea, and how often they were eating and interacting with other bears. There were some really fascinating clips of bears picking up blocks of ice and throwing them into the water, which they seem to be doing to try to entice seals to move into the water, and they're trying to hunt seals in the water. And so they have some really unique and incredible behaviors that are really individualistic. And so it's really fascinating just to have the opportunity to work on them.
Yeah, I think that's one of the neat things here about the work that you're both doing here. We've got a lot of different interesting uses of technology here, and a lot of it's sort of, you're trying to gain information by using these sensors, these things out in the field, but to actually get to see polar bears doing what they're doing is pretty rare. I mean, the video footage that we were all just watching there, I mean, that's whatever, maybe 20 years ago or what, that would have been unheard of, right? Like to watch what a polar bear does out on the sea ice. This is not a place where humans spend a lot of time. It's quite a dangerous place for people to be. I mean, this is pretty unique stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's been probably the biggest challenge we've had in studying these animals, is because they occur in such a remote environment, because they're large and obviously can be dangerous given the fact that they're a large carnivore. You can't just walk up to a bluff and watch them. We're lucky that Ian Sterling back in the 1970s was able to find a bluff where he could observe polar bears for a period of time and document their basic behavior. And that's really served as the foundation for what we know about polar bear behavior on the sea ice. But beyond that work, we have very little information about their basic daily activities, how often they're catching seals, how often they're interacting with other bears. And so this type of video footage, like I said, we put collars on 10 bears and monitored their behavior based on the video that we recorded over the course of about 2 weeks. And it provided us really new insight into how often they're spending walking, how often they're resting, how often they're actually successfully catching seals, and so how well they're doing at actually meeting their energy demands. So we could measure what their energy expenditure was based on that Fitbit type style device, but then we could actually quantify how much they were actually getting in return based on how often they were catching seals. And so it's really giving us a lot of in-depth and detailed information about what the bears are actually doing in this environment where we really haven't had much information to work from. And yeah, that was a bear actually diving after a seal and trying to catch it, and the seal swam away.
Ah, so cool. It is so neat to see. So we got some other really great questions here. We've got a really fun one from Ethan here. If you're just tuning in, you maybe missed my comments about my favorite food being a corn dog. Of course, if a polar bear could eat a corn dog, what would be its most favorite or preferred condiment? Megan, what do you think? What would be a polar bear's favorite condiment?
I think a polar bear's favorite condiment on a corn dog would be lard.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
But in absence of lard, I would say mayonnaise. You know, if you're talking about standard condiments, anything with high fat content is going to be appealing to a polar bear.
That's
Great
a good
question.
one. I like lard. Yeah. And Anthony, I don't know if you're going to be able to top that one. That's pretty tough.
No, I was thinking ketchup just because that's my favorite condiment, but I think lard is probably most suitable for a polar bear.
Yeah, that's fair. Totally. Another good question from Emanuela here. And do polar bears change their fur seasonally? So do polar bears molt?
That's a great question. And actually, that's a question that we are addressing at a number of zoos right now. We have a researcher from the University of Washington. She's doing her PhD. And understanding whether or not polar bears molt and how frequently they molt actually is of critical importance to our scientific monitoring of wild populations. And so they do lose their hair throughout the year. But understanding sort of the seasonality of that hair loss, and they have different types of hair on their body, and whether all of that hair molts on the same schedule is a really important question, and we're just zooming in on the details as we speak. It's been a really exciting study. And this is, again, an area where our zookeepers have been right front and center in the research and really making a difference for conservation science.
I think this is a good point that, you know, when I was little, I remember thinking that, you know, there's all these adults out there in the world and they know all the answers to everything. And that's definitely not true. If you're a youngster and you're tuning in, or maybe not a youngster, you know, there's still room in the polar bear world and in the wildlife world in general for answers to questions that have yet to be fulfilled. So so definitely this is a good one, and like Megan said, there's somebody working on this right now. Something maybe you thought as simple as, do polar bears lose their hair and how often? Maybe you'd think we'd know that, but it has yet to be fully discovered. So so tune back in. Maybe next year we'll do a full webcast on on polar bear molting. This is another good question here. So polar bears need fat to survive. We covered that a little earlier. They need, you know, what was it, about 12,000 calories per day. Ideally, they're eating and eating and eating this time of year to really bulk up and get really fat so that they can make it through a time, maybe the summertime, without much food. Mac is asking, what is the average weight change, maybe the maximum and the minimum weight of both male and female polar bears in the wild?
Yeah, so
Anthony, you got
so with females, they'll typically in the spring be around about 400 pounds, and that's kind of around their smallest size, right around in March, right before they really start catching seals and putting on a lot of mass. And so by kind of the mid to late summer, they'll basically almost double their mass. So a 400-pound female polar bear will go from 400 pounds to close to 800 pounds. And then a male, it can vary, but males tend to be closer to about 900 to 1,000 pounds. And they might get up to 1,200 to maybe even 1,400 pounds by the mid to late summer. So they can put on an amazing amount of weight, and that's something that actually medical doctors have been interested in learning more about is how these animals can manage to put on so much fat and basically almost double their mass. Whereas if you think of a human doing something like that, it would be completely unhealthy, and there'd be heart issues and things like that. And these animals do it every year. It's amazing.
It's totally amazing. Yeah. Well, I want to thank everybody for the great questions today. I want to thank our panelists for taking time to be with us and talk a little bit about polar bears. And I think it's a fun little conversation we had here. If you're a student or an adult and you're charged with online learning, please visit the Polar Bears International Education Center. We've got all sorts of resources on there for both of you. Also want to thank our Arctic Ambassador Centers to help fund this important work and other work that Polar Bears International is involved in. I want to thank our partner Explore.org today for helping us do these broadcasts. They've got something like 100 cameras all over the world on all different sorts of species. Of course, our favorite is the polar bear cam, but they have other ones too. So go check it out. Really neat stuff there. Thanks everybody for tuning in. And we will be back next week, next Tuesday. So please join us again. Thanks.